Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Millennials Are Old podcast, where you know what, Brian? There's just sometimes in life is just not going well. You know what I mean?
No?
I just wish there was somebody out there to just clean this world of all the scum. Maybe a man who is above a human being.
Taxi driver, Travis Bickle?
Yes, that too. Or the Joker, too, which
Oh.
I believe was the inspiration for Taxi Driver, but I could be wrong about
That's
that.
correct.
Somebody who might be super, a man who is super.
Or Uber.
Yes. And I'm not talking about somebody who would clean the world of like rich people or whatever, because we all know rich people are great. We're talking about people that will beat up like poor street thugs. That's who I'm talking about. Those are the real criminals in this world.
That's the root of all of the problems.
As Christopher Nolan taught me. But yes, without further ado, with this very awkward introduction, let's get into our first TV show that we're reviewing, or I should say serial, the 1940s Superman serials. Now, Brian, this was your recommendation for this week. Why'd you want to talk about the 1940s Fleischer and famous Superman serials?
So I've watched these a lot. I first became aware of them, I think, when I was 9 years old. And I revisit them less frequently over the years, but still probably once every other year or so, every 2 or 3 years, I'd say I rewatch them. And every time I revisit them, in the general popular culture, superheroes in that time have gotten more and more ubiquitous. And every time I revisit this series, I always think of how, first of all, the fact that it's now over 80 years old, then like how much the superhero genre fundamentally hasn't changed in a lot of ways, and then also how it has changed, and particularly how it has changed in its media presentation. And I thought that would be interesting to look at, because at the time that this serial came out, this was the only superhero media outside of comic books. I'm pretty confident in saying. Whereas now, pretty much the great swath of like pop culture media that you could see on a given day might come from like a superhero comic book. I just thought that would be interesting to look at.
Yeah, no, I agree. And doing some research for this episode, I was genuinely shocked how influential this was really on not even just animation and superheroes, but just general world pop culture. I was not aware of this at all. And to find out that it was as well public domain made me very happy to find out as well.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that, because there's some weird stuff that comes up with this being public domain. Crazy influential series. One of the things to start this off, and we'll get more to it, is I would have a hard time showing this to someone who wasn't like a big pop culture nerd, but it is very primitive feeling in a lot of ways, which I mean, I don't feel that way, but I think it would seem that way to a lot of casual superhero audiences now, but hugely influential. Like you see echoes of it in everything. The phrase like faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive doesn't come directly from this serial, but it comes directly from the radio show that predates it. Superman flying comes pretty directly from this serial. Even the idea of superheroes flying and not just being really strong guys kind of comes from this serial. It's kind of crazy to think about.
It is. And you actually mentioned some of the trivia that I have here, so I'm glad that you said those things, because there is some trivia. No, it's all good. I'm just saying that, yeah, very much so. Just to give you a little hint, that's how influential this series is. Like, things that are now ubiquitous for Superman and a lot of just superhero media in general started off with this TV show. I should say this serial. My apologies once again. But speaking of, let's get into some details here. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is from the 1940s. This was released from the years of 1941 to 1943. Now, keep in mind till 1943, because the latter half of the series has a lot to do with those years. They're very...
Yeah. I mean, it's racist.
Yeah,
that's what it is.
Yeah, it's very racist, and also it's very specific to this time period.
Yeah, I have no problem with saying the second half of episodes here take place after the war, and they're largely the last, I think, 7 episodes. Is it? I think it's divided into 9 episodes. We'll get there. Are World War II propaganda. They just are.
Yeah, I believe it's episodes 1 through 9 are the Fleischer series, and episodes 10
correct.
through 17 are the famous series. And you'll see it because it is a stark divide. It is a stark divide.
I actually had to think, and I've been a fan of this series for a long time. But a lot of times when I look at other people's takes on it, people tend to say, and we'll get there more when we get there, but they'll say, well, yeah, so by the time the famous studios episodes are coming out, we're in the war, so there's like a propaganda episodes, but people will usually say, but the actual quality of the episodes remains the same. I'm not sure I agree with that.
I disagree pretty immensely with that.
Yeah,
but,
me too.
Before I get too much of my opinions on that, let's get into some more details here. So this series is unrated as far as I'm aware of.
Yeah.
This was released during the very early years of the Hays Code. During the Hays Code, there were no ratings. Every movie and TV show just had to be under the Hays Code. These shorts were directed at one point in time by Dave Fleischer, Seymour Nightel, Isidore Sparber, and Dan Gordon. Now, once again, these shorts were directed at various points in time by any of these people. I was not able to find specific directors of each. And the stories were written in various times as well by, again, Seymour Nightel, Isidore Sparber, Bill Turner, Ted Pierce, Dan Gordon, Carl Mayer, Jay Morton, and Robert Little. Most of these people do not have Wikipedia articles, so I did not do too much research into them. And the shorts were produced by Max Fleischer, Sam Buchwald, Dan Gordon, Seymour Nightel, and Isidore Sparber once again. And all the shorts combined are about 120 minutes long. And each of the shorts roughly range from about 8 to, I think one's 11 minutes, but I think they're all roughly about 8 to 10 minutes for all of them.
Compared to superhero media of the last 20 years, which is often very serialized and chapter heavy, these are kind of more like reading a newspaper comic strip. They're very bare bones. Every episode, you have your characters, which are basically your recurring characters, I guess, are Clark and Lois. And an event happens. There's a very succinct beginning, middle, and end to each of these, which would seem really strange to audiences, not just now, but probably audiences over the last probably 40 years even. But, this was early animation cinema, very early action-adventure animation cinema. Very ambitious to even do some of this. Fleischer Studios did not want to do the Superman license. I'm sure you probably have a little bit about that in there, because they didn't think it was possible to do an action animation short, and they were kind of backed into doing it.
Yeah, very much so. And that's actually my very next detail. The budget was allegedly, this is what I found allegedly on IMDb, the budget was about $50,000 per episode, but I was not able to find any box office info. Now, once again, I assume serials, because these were probably released in theaters, so there could have theoretically been box office info, but I wasn't able to find any. However, once again, $50,000 per episode.
I don't know that there's box office returns for them, because this also predates, the multiplex leader. But these were hugely successful.
Speaking of acclaim, I was not able to find any reliable Rotten Tomatoes reviews on all the shorts. I mean, there's reviews for some of them, but definitely not all of them, so I decided not to even include it, because that would have taken forever to go through.
Yeah, this is kind of, if people listening haven't figured out, a little bit different in that, because it's a series, most of the reviews you're going to find, in my experience, again, I've been a fan of the series for a while, I'm guessing, Taylor, a lot of the reviews you found were on editions of this, so were on VHS editions or DVD editions that people had, rather than on specifically the show. Would that be right?
Yes, and especially considering this is our first, well, now we consider it a TV show, but of course at the time it was a film serial. But in general, TV shows nowadays, individual episodes get Rotten Tomatoes and IMDb reviews in the many, but definitely not 80 years ago. And then let's get into some trivia. So I know you mentioned some of the trivia facts earlier, but the first one I have here is the very first episode of the series marks the first appearance on film of the famous introduction, Faster Than a Speeding Bullet, and Look Up in the Sky, etc. So a lot of firsts on film were in this series. And I know you mentioned they were on radio before film, right?
Yes. And one of the things that it's crazy to think, these shorts probably for a significant portion of the audience, you have to remember, were the first time they were seeing the character Superman. Whether you're a fan of Superman or superheroes, it almost doesn't matter. I want you to think about that. To anyone that tries to watch these, because that kind of does color, I think, these shorts differently. Superman debuted in late 38 or I think it was 39 in Action Comics. It was immediately very popular in the comic books, but this would be the first superhero crossover media. So they have to bring this character who still is kind of audacious for 1940, still kind of has these weird sci-fi elements that, could be off-putting to a lot of people. A lot of newspapers didn't want to carry Superman, the comic strip, because of that. And they have to introduce this character as fresh and as easily understandable as possible. Because it's a kind of, for 1940s, still, the Fleischers were thinking this is kind of an out there concept. They kind of didn't want to do this character.
Yeah, and speaking of Action Comics number one, another crossover with a different podcast I have done. You know who owned a copy of Action Comics number one, right? Nic Cage.
Oh, of course, yeah.
His never-ending list of possessions that has made him like $50 million owed to the IRS.
That's such a like and I love, I grew up reading like I'm a pretty casual comic fan myself, but there's something about like casual comic book fans, celebrity collectors, where they love Superman, man. Jerry Seinfeld and Nic Cage, like they love him.
Let's get into some more trivia here. So we were talking about the budget earlier. Max Fleischer and Dave Fleischer were reluctant to take this assignment because it would require much more realistic designs and animation than they usually used. They tried to discourage Paramount by stating they would need a budget of around $100,000 per short, 4 times the budget of an average Walt Disney cartoon. Imagine that. This random studio are like, hey, we're going to make this, but we're going to make it 4 times more expensive than the most influential and largest media company in history now. But apparently they agreed to a little bit of it.
Fleischer were, by all accounts, that was an inflated number that they were giving Paramount so that they would not have to do this project because they didn't want to appear uncooperative. Yeah.
Although, interestingly enough, Brian, they actually agreed to about half that budget, which is still amazing because that's double the budget. Can you, oh God, I can't even fucking imagine that. That took a lot of balls to be able to do. And just for a little context, $100,000 back then is about $2.2 million now. Which is for nowadays, that's not a crazy amount to spend on a media property, but media was still very new back then. So the fact that they spent $1.1 million per episode on this would have been insane. I'm sure all their backers were like, what the fuck are you doing? Don't do this.
For kind of an idea of, again, why Fleischer might not want to do this, their claims to fame, to any listeners who don't know, other than Superman, are Popeye and Betty Boop. Those are their other big iconic characters. And that was their house style. They did not want to be stuck doing this hyper youth male oriented action character. This is a very scary thing. And it's also, again, it's a new, basically, Superman had been proven in the comic book medium for the last few months, but again, probably looking like a fad right now. Superman is probably looking to most people before this comes out like a thing that's going to be gone within a year.
Yeah, because you're mentioning the release date of Action Comics. So Action Comics was released in April and then June of 1938. So this was only a 3-year-old property at the time. So this was a big fucking gamble. This was a big gamble, and it turned out pretty well. And you were talking about some other facts earlier, but this series is where Superman learned to fly. Prior to this, he was only able to leap tall buildings in a single bound. It was deemed that leaping would not look right on film. However, even when Superman flies, it looks as if he needs to make a jumping start rather than just taking off, which I did notice that part too.
So there's a little bit behind this. Superman's creators, Siegel and Schuster, they did not want Superman to fly. They did not want Superman to fly. They did not want him to have X-ray vision. They wanted him to be a man who is basically human, but very, very strong. So the first instance of Superman kind of flying is the radio show, which is the predecessor to this. It directly precedes it in its cast and kind of in its general style, where the writers of the radio show were having a hard time writing their way out of some things. And they were thinking, we've already got Superman jumping all around. He can already jump as high and as far as we need him to, given his predicament. And they wrote in to just have him hovering over something, not full on flying, but hovering above the ground. Either Siegel or Schuster heard this episode or was made aware of it and were so mad. And they called up the radio show complaining and saying Superman doesn't fly. That's not the deal.
Did they put on their glasses Superman doesn't fly?
Oh man, Siegel and Schuster do. I love Siegel and Schuster, and we'll talk a little bit about kind of why they created Superman. And I don't know if how they got fucked over, and even how by this point Superman's already a little different from their initial vision. In a few ways, but they probably did because they were a couple of 20-year-old kids who, again, I don't know if you read, they sold the Superman character to National, which became DC, I think, for about $500.
Oh Jesus! To be fair,
cash.
that wasn't not a good chunk of change back then. But in retrospect, oh man.
Yeah. Well, they also. So here's the thing, and we'll just get this out of the way. This is related to the Superman comic book character and Siegel and Schuster in DC, and not directly this. But they created Superman in high school in 1931 together, and they were shopping it around for 7 years. They were so depressed and frustrated that nobody wanted it. They just wanted to see their cool character in print because they thought it was cool. Imagine if you and your best friend in high school are like sci-fi nerds. Yeah. And you make a character that's really cool. And you're pretty sure you could get it published, and you're trying to for 7 years. And then some company's like, yeah, we'll publish this for $500. And you're thinking probably this will be the only one. They sign everything about the character away for $500. Of course, they still worked on Superman for about 10 years, but they were upset that Superman flew. I have mixed feelings about that. I kind of think it's cool in these early Superman years when he doesn't fly. I think it gives him a few more stakes. It gives him a little bit more to overcome. And I would argue that I kind of think in the first year of this series, the Fleischer years, that he's not flying. It kind of seems to me more like he's jumping than full on flying, but it's kind of vague. Of course, it's probably for the best that Superman ended up flying because it looks fantastic and we get Christopher Reeves and all that. Yeah, this is the beginning of Superman full on flying. The radio show, and I think that this series, I couldn't confirm this, but I would be willing to bet that there is some shared talent between this and the Superman radio show in the writers as well. They were kind of sneakily having Superman fly just as out of convenience, hoping that Siegel and Schuster wouldn't find out. And then by the time Fleischer are doing this, eventually they're like, he should just fly. It'll look more exciting. And it does. This is some of the most exciting animation in any like action cartoon I've ever seen are in the Fleischer years of Superman.
No, for sure. I will agree with that. And especially once we get to the individual episodes, I do want to talk about the animation because the animation is genuinely pretty good outside of the latter half. But the first half is great.
I mean, so even the famous studio stuff is, I think, pretty clearly above average. It's better than most animation that you would see now.
Yeah, but it's just not up to the standard of the first half.
It's not. And then it's below standard for that.
Well, part of that also might be due, and we'll obviously get to that in more depth once we get to the actual reviews of that. But I think part of the second half of why it looks I should say fairly worse is probably due to budgetary constraints due to the war years.
It's due to the war, and of course the Fleischers are gone. The lead directors who oversaw this program are now gone in influx, and we'll get there when we get there. Sorry. If the stories in the famous studio episodes were as fun and as exciting to watch and as funny as the Fleischer years, I would be able to overlook the drop in animation quality. But as you'll see, I would say that's not really the case.
Next fact I have here is in episode 2, this cartoon is the first Superman story in which Clark Kent changes into his Superman costume inside a phone booth. So I thought that was interesting because of course
that makes sense.
That's a very stereotypical Superman thing now. To be fair, a superhero thing in general throughout the decades was them changing in like a phone booth or something.
We like to make jokes about that, and of course it is funny to think now, especially as phone booths become obsolete. But I'm willing to bet that in the 1930s and 1940s, that seemed like a sneakier ploy. You know what I mean? Because now, even when you get by the 60s, in Marvel Stan Lee comics, he's got Spider-Man making jokes about like how he's like, oh, maybe I could change into his phone booth. Boy, that would be dumb. Kind of taking like little pot shots at, the distinguished competition. But I think in 1940, you could argue that a guy could walk into a phone booth on a busy street and then walk out in a costume, and people might not have noticed as much because how many phone booths were there, who was paying attention, and also maybe because that wasn't a trope yet. I don't know. There is a transformation in this series, I think in episode 3 or 4, that's very funny to me, though, even in the context of the time, because Clark just is in his place of work, the Daily Planet. He walks into a stockroom and Superman walks out, and it's like, what are you doing? Just walking through the building like this?
Also, another fact that I have here that's very influential. So I don't know how true this is, but I put it on here because I thought it was interesting. And this is actually relevant to, once again, another podcast project that I did. In episode 4, the thought-out Tyrannosaurus was the partial inspiration for Godzilla. So I thought that was interesting to see. And it makes sense. Yeah. So you see it, and this was, a solid decade plus before. Because Godzilla came out in 1954, I believe.
That was one of the 2 times that I podcasted with you prior to this series, was your Godzilla bracket. That's right.
Classic Godzilla. So if anybody's not seen any of the Godzilla movies, which I don't know how the fuck
they're so cool
at this point.
They're so fucking cool.
The first Godzilla film is like a genuine masterpiece.
No, it is. Fantastic. It is. It's, and they're all good, but that first one is, if you think Godzilla is like this funny, like camp character, I would implore you to watch the first film.
Oh, yes. And definitely not the American one. Definitely watch the Japanese one.
Watch the original. But, oh my God, imagine, I mean, there's no way this was ever going to happen, but, the original, incarnation of Godzilla, the 50s Godzilla, and the Fleischer Superman in a crossover, boy, that would make me so happy.
To be fair, there are quite a few crossovers in the Godzilla series, so it might have happened.
It could have happened at one point, especially,
Yeah, especially during the King Kong fight, the King Kong movie. I'm sure they were thinking, who else can we get? Let's get Batman versus Godzilla. Let's get Superman.
Well, fuck, there was the King Kong versus Frankenstein thing.
Oh, gosh, yes.
Awesome. Fucking awesome, man.
Next fact I have here, in episode 7, unlike the other Superman cartoons, this film has the characters in the Daily Planet set explicitly in New York City rather than Metropolis. Now, once again, we're talking about the famous ones being racist. Episode 7 is racist too, don't forget that one.
I want to say, too, I'm not sure. I'm not trying to say that Fleischer were very good and famous were racist. And it's not like I think necessarily the Fleischers were like, we're not going to do that. We just weren't at war yet, is what I realistically think it was.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Most likely Fleischer would have, just as an aside, Fleischer historically did actually have a more diverse animation and directing crew ethnically. I was doing some research about some of the racist stuff than Famous did, but I don't think that's why Fleischer doesn't have racist episodes. I think they just weren't at war. We weren't at war when Fleischer were doing their episodes yet.
It's kind of like Chinese and Japanese racism before the war. Obviously, there was plenty of it. There was plenty of anti-Chinese pogroms on the West Coast, but
you weren't necessarily going to see it in a movie.
Yeah, it reached a massive fever pitch during World War II. Obviously, much more so the Japanese than the Chinese, but still, every Asian group were horrifically transgressed upon during World War. It was really the nadir of Asian American race relations. It was bad.
And we'll talk to a little bit, maybe when we get there, about Siegel and Schuster were already pretty uncomfortable with that. Well, they did write and draw in the comic books during the war years some questionable material, some World War II propaganda material for DC Comics. Pretty fundamental to their idea of Superman was that he was implicit. This isn't really in any of these cartoons. It doesn't really get touched on. The initial idea of Superman is basically that he's like Roosevelt. And I'm not joking. They envisioned him as an embodiment of the New Deal.
Wasn't Superman, because Siegel and Schuster were both Jewish.
No, they both were, I believe, yeah. I mean, I have a hard time believing Schuster wasn't Jewish.
Well, I just hear Siegel, and I'm like,
yeah, no, they were. I mean,
working class Jewish kids in Cleveland or something.
Yeah, they were in Cleveland. So those first few Superman those first issues of Action Comics when he's appearing, Superman is bullying lobbyists and corrupt senators and domestic abusers. That's his. He goes around and he intimidates these people who are slimy and they're exploiting the owner of a mine whose workers are in unsafe working conditions, and he goes and he makes the owner of the mine work down there with him, so he sees the dangerous conditions. That's in this third Superman story ever. That was initially what Superman was to Siegel and Schuster. Now, they did create some questionable stuff during the war, but they also, or at least they said later on in years, they said that DC kind of pressured them to. They had a lot of other problems with DC Comics, so who's to say how true that is? But that's what they've claimed later in life, is that they didn't want to do that stuff and that they didn't they actually didn't really like a lot of this series, even though I'm sure it made them, it wouldn't have made them money because they didn't get any royalties.
Well, speaking of Brian, if you really like the working class origins of Superman, you'll absolutely love the Injustice series of video games featuring Superman, because in that series, they make him a fascist dictator.
So I'm not opposed to the idea of Superman becoming a bad guy like that. I think there's something interesting to be said for that. One of my favorite Superman stories ever is DC does a lot of stories they call Elseworlds. So they're non-canonical alternate timelines. It's a one-shot graphic novel called Red Sun. The idea is, what if Kal-El, instead of landing in Kansas and being adopted by this farming family in the US, landed in the Soviet Union? And the fundamental message is they basically make him kind of still, like, the idea is that he's still Superman. He still has a capacity for good, but he believes in, like, Stalin. And you can take it either, it's kind of up in the air on whether it's satire or whether it's not. But the idea is that if Superman were shot anywhere else, he would just incorporate that culture's idea of good, but he wouldn't, like, be bad. And I think it's a cool take on the character because it sort of reconciles in a sort of tongue-in-cheek way his, like, vaguely socialist origins.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's one of those things where I played the Injustice games, and I don't think they're great. They're definitely not as good as Mortal Kombat.
I just don't like the way they look.
But they do look quite bad, if I'm being honest. And making Superman into a fascist dictator, not a big fan of that. It's kind of stupid.
Well, like, the thing is, too, like, we all know about Frank Miller and his Batman stuff and how he made Batman a fascist.
Yes.
And I've read Frank Miller's initial Batman stuff when I was like 8-10 years old. And I thought even at that age that it was commenting on kind of the weird implications of Batman. So I was like, oh, this is brilliant. And as literally a 9 or 10-year-old kid, it blew my mind because I thought he was making some commentary on superheroes and fascism and like criminals' rights and things. Mm-hmm. And for years I thought that. Come to find out as I get older, Frank Miller is just a psycho and that's what he thinks is cool. He's like, yeah, wouldn't it be cool if Batman just stabbed criminals in the like arteries with a big shard of glass because he didn't care about their rights? And I'm like, oh.
Well, speaking of fascists, this next fact I have here is kind of related to that. In episode 17, which was the last episode of the series, this is the only one that does not feature Lois Lane. However, Joan Alexander, who played Lois Lane in the earlier shorts, has an uncredited role as the unnamed secret agent, the double agent, I believe.
Was that confusing? I wanted to ask you about that because I watched that episode. Like, I've watched these a lot. I was unclear on whether or not that character was supposed to be Lois or not.
I don't believe it was.
I don't think it was either. They just reused the model.
Yeah, the Nazi double agent or whatever.
Yeah, but like but sometimes you're like, is Lois a double agent for the Nazis in this episode? Because they just use her model and they make it, a blonde lady.
Well, she is. She's a spy on behalf of America against the Japanese in a segment. So maybe Joan Alexander is just a costume for Lois Lane, but apparently accordingly not. So speaking of the episodes, I have some very brief descriptions of each of the episodes. So in episode 1 of Superman, I believe this one's just called Superman.
Yeah, it has subsequently been called The Mad Scientist in collections, but it's just called Superman.
Yes, and speaking of, the mad scientist threatens to use his electro ray to cause total destruction to those who had mocked and laughed at him. Lois Lane pilots an airplane to his mountaintop laboratory, but the scientist has her bound and gagged before she's able to escape. He forces her to watch on a television as his ray destroys a bridge. Next, he uses the ray to topple over the Daily Planet, but Clark Kent changes to Superman in time to save the building and put his indestructible body in front of the ray. Now, you were talking about how the original Siegel and Schuster wanted to just make him like a Superman. They didn't want to make him like a god, right?
Yeah.
And I liked in this episode because when he's putting himself in front of the ray, like he's having a hard time.
Yeah, like, he still struggles with taking damage.
Which I prefer that more to like the God Superman. I don't really like God Superman, if I'm being honest.
I'm fine with it now because, like, I grew up reading, and I love the Christopher Reeve Superman. I love a lot of that stuff. This is my favorite version of Superman. The way that I read, and I think it comes off really well in the Fleischer animation, Superman's struggling. Like he struggles to lift really heavy things. He struggles when a laser hits him. It feels like they communicate through the character's body language that he's not going to die, but he still, like, takes damage. An attack won't bounce off of him. It's still going to cause him pain. He can just run through it.
Yeah, and I really did like the fact that he's seemingly at least a little bit fallible, which he is definitely not in modern day superhero media. He definitely is not.
No.
And
well, even like morally, that's another thing I like about this version of Superman that comes up a few times and comes up a lot in the comic books. The Superman concept there is Superman's kind of a dick.
Yeah,
like he's just kind of condescending.
Well, and that's the thing, right? Like, if you were a god and you had to interact with mortals all day, you probably would be kind of a dick. It's kind of and I know this is a very tired comparison at this point because the series has been going on for a while and has been talked about endlessly, but I like The Boys, the TV show, because Homelander is like what a realistic Superman would be. Like, he's just a fucking asshole who's just like who's a monster, doesn't give a shit about anybody but himself. That's probably what Superman would be like in real life.
So this era of Superman is probably my favorite Superman ever. And part of that is because he still is not quite a god. He's like a Superman. I also like the whole Roosevelt Democrat angle that he had very early on. I just think that's kind of cool and interesting. But also, because there is a case to be made that at this point, the alter ego of Superman is Clark Kent. That Clark Kent is the persona and Superman is the real personality instead of vice versa, which is how it would become in later decades, if that makes sense. So Clark Kent is like a persona that Superman creates to live amongst us, and it's kind of what he thinks of us. He's like, oh, humans are all cowardly and weak and sniveling, and they hide from everything. Yeah. And so that's how he acts as Clark Kent.
And that's the thing, Brian, is that you nailed it right on the head, because Lois Lane wants nothing to do with Clark Kent. She's like, ooh, Clark Kent, you're a weirdo. Fuck you. But Superman's like, yeah. Ooh, Superman. It's just like, it's so great.
That's such a classic superhero trope all the way through to the 60s and 70s. One of my favorite Spider-Man arcs from the 1970s has Spider-Man having this sexual tension with a cat burglar named the Black Cat. And then they're like flirting, and he's like, I think I love you. And he takes off his mask, and she's like, oh, you're some boring nerd.
Yeah, it is really funny. Like nowadays, a lot of superhero, like the actual person, not the alter ego, are like cool and whatever. But back then, they were all like beta fucking nerds. Like, it's just hilarious.
Well, like, or it's like,
or just normal guys too, I guess.
The very early superheroes, Superman and Batman at this point, almost are like kind of psycho, because like even if you look at Batman comics from this era, there's like no personality when they're not the superhero. It's like they're wearing a human suit.
All right, let's get to the second episode here. Now this one's called The Mechanical Monsters.
One of my favorite ones.
Yes, absolutely. I love this one to death. And I will say earlier, I forgot to mention it, I think episode 1 is my second favorite. And I'll go over my favorite in just a moment. It is fantastic. These first like 3 or 4 episodes are great.
A couple other things I want to say actually about episode 1 before we move on. No Ma and Pa Kent in this. They really trim the fat off as Superman because they have less than 10 minutes in most cases to tell a story. So we don't know where Superman was raised. Doesn't matter. Don't really need to know anything about it. He's Clark Kent, works at the Daily Planet, and then he's Superman, and he fights bad guys. My other point, there are a lot of mad scientists in this series. And again, just to give an idea of how early this is in Superman.
But no Lex Luthor.
No Lex Luthor. Exactly. Exactly. And you think if this had been made about a year later, maybe 2 years later, then they would have done this almost exactly the same, but maybe all of these characters would have been Lex Luthor, and he would be a recurring nemesis. No Lex Luthor in this. I hope that is a good illustrative point of how early this is in Superman. There's no lore. They literally just had the character, and I think that's part of why this is so good. Is because they were able to just make simple Superman stories.
Exactly. They have Superman, they have Lois Lane, and they have the Daily Planet. That's it. That's it.
What's the bullshit with Avengers shit and Marvel shit that makes it suck? That they have 80 years of content. Well, not really. They have like 50 years of continuity, and they need to please all these fucking nerds that want everything to fit their exact cues and their whims of their preferred version of the character. But here, there is one superhero that exists, and it's Superman, and he's just Superman. And you can tell any story with him, so you just make cool fucking short stories, and it works so well, especially for the first few episodes of this.
Yeah. So speaking of, let's get into the second episode here. A scientist has an army of flying robots able to steal anything in sight. When a robot crashes into a bank building, it steals all the precious stones in sight, while the policeman's bullets harm it no more than flies. Clark and Lois are at the exhibit. While Clark phones in the story from a booth, Lois stows away in the robot's compartment. Now, I did like this scene a lot because she's just stuck in this compartment with a bunch of jewels flying away as Clark is trying to catch her. And because, of course, he's not a god yet, he's having a hard time catching up to it. And he gets caught into some fucking electrical lines and gets stuck there for a while. It's pretty funny.
Superman being caught in the electrical lines, I actually put in my notes, that is one of my favorite bits of Superman art ever. Just seeing him getting kind of mildly shot by these electrical lines, it's slowing him down and he's pulling them off and yanking them off. I just think it looks really cool. It really is. I just think it's a really exciting set piece, and it really is illustrative of what's cool about this series. My other thing, and I'd like to point out, is some people have made jokes saying that because of the era that this series of films is maybe a little misogynistic. I don't really agree with that. I don't think it's like feminist or anything, but Lois takes a pretty proactive role. She generally isn't put in her place for it. Like, I do have a funny note that I think in 15 of the 17 episodes, the inciting incident is Lois running directly into danger to get a story.
Yeah.
But that's not treated, at least in this series, I can't think of any examples where she's treated as being stupid for that. Like she's just trying to get a story.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I would definitely not describe this as misogynistic, especially for the early 1940s.
For the time. Yeah, yeah.
Like, I would say fairly progressive even.
Well, at least, like, I mean, she takes a pretty active role. Like, okay,
Yeah.
I have to imagine, relative to other things in a kid's serialized film short in 1940, if, like, a young girl is watching this, I mean, obviously she could still identify with Superman, and a lot of them probably did because he's the hero. But if you wanted to identify with Lois, you could still feel pretty cool for that. I mean, I don't know. I wasn't there, but so I thought that was interesting. The robots are basically boxes with arms and legs, which I love.
But yeah, the robot returns to the scientist's hideout with Lois, but does not have any jewelry. She refuses to tell the scientist where it is. He retaliates by tying her up and setting her on a platform over a pot of boiling metal. Yeah, this show gets pretty, like, rough for, like, a kid's show.
Yeah, so there's some great early on in this episode. We're going to keep saying episode because it's just, that's what they are now, you know? It's like,
yeah, they're all
now.
episodes, yeah.
But early on when the robots are first attacking, you know, the jewelry exhibits and the banks and things, you would usually get to see cops and guards straight up shooting, like, guns at robots. Like actual like machine guns and stuff. And I remember thinking like, oh, first of all, the animation looks cool and it's just cool to see. I've been thinking like, oh, yeah, that's right. You could just straight up have guns, like realistic guns firing at people in cartoons back then.
And the very end of the episode is, of course, Superman saves the day. He fights all the robots. He saves Lois, and they escape before she's obviously able to get burned by the molten metal. So, once again, another fantastic episode. This is not my favorite, but it is definitely up there. Probably like my top 3 or 4. It's very good. I like
one of the best fights. Really culminates in like an all-out, like really for the time, a brawl. Superman surrounded by these robots. They're giving him haymakers while other ones are shooting like fire at him out of their fucking faces. And just a good kind of like he's really boxing with him. Pretty cool. Also a good time to point out a lot of these episodes you get to see why it was such a good idea to have Clark working at a newspaper, because in almost every episode you see a newspaper or you hear a radio report that basically summarizes immediately what's going to happen in the episode.
All right, next episode here is $1 Billion Limited. An enormous gold shipment en route to the mint is hijacked by well-armed robbers, and Lois Lane is trapped in the runaway locomotive. This looks like a job for Superman. Now, this is also a great episode, and you were talking about how Lois Lane takes charge. She shoots a gun at these guys.
Yeah, pretty cool. There's obviously some pretty questionable and pretty funny Lois things we can get into even at the time from the comic books. But in this series, for the most part, she's pretty proactive and she gets to do some cool stuff. So I thought that was nice. While watching this, I thought it was a good time to point out the big conceit of Superman early on, one of them for Siegel and Schuster. And I think that, while the politics are not reflected in this series, the idea that Siegel and Schuster had in the 30s for Superman was that he is a man without technology who could stand up and go toe-to-toe with all of these radical technological and industrial changes that were happening. That sort of, to me, is the subtext of Superman in this era. So you see things like these at the time, these very sophisticated bank robbers who are, you know, manipulating train tracks and things. And the idea is like, we have all this kind of frightening and exciting new technology happening in America. But what if there was a guy who was like, just by nature of being who he is, was as strong as all of that? I actually think this episode showcases that pretty well. I don't know if they were conscious of that, but
because he's like moving train tracks away from like fucking dynamite and rerouting trains that way. Like he is strong, obviously, and stronger than any living human could ever be. But he's not. Once again, he's not a god. He is trying his best, and he just barely scrapes by a lot of the time.
And it's also like, I mean, this is a nitpicky thing, but sometimes when I look at Superman stuff, including while I was watching this, I was thinking, boy, he's not very big. You know, when you compare to like guys on roids that you see nowadays, you're like, he's pretty normal looking. So that is impressive that he's doing all this.
And you know, you look at who was the first live actor for Superman in the 50s? I can't remember his name.
Reeves, George Reeves.
Oh, yeah, George Reeves, not Christopher Reeves, George Reeves, right?
No, George Reeves.
And you look at him, and he's kind of like a big chubby guy. Like he's not,
which is cool. I like that. That's also true of Adam West's Batman. Has a little pot belly.
Very true. Yes. I do tell people a lot, especially people who aren't as into like working out and fitness as me at this point. Like they think of like big strong guys as, what Hugh Jackman is in Wolverine, or, just whatever big, or like Brad Pitt from Fight Club or whatever. But most of those guys are like starving to death. They're not that strong.
Yeah.
The strongest guys in existence are super muscular guys who are also fat as shit.
Well,
those are the strongest guys in the world.
You've jogged a memory for me. So in an art class in junior high, I don't know why, I had a pretty cool but kind of quirky art teacher, like all art teachers for elementary and junior high students are. But she had us watch Jason and the Argonauts as like a special event. And I remember when, all the guys have their shirts off, and some of these kids, I was in junior high in, like the 2000s. And these are all kids that are watching NFL at the time and probably watching like WWE or whatever. And they're getting kind of mean about the actors on screen, and they're going like, they really weren't that in shape back then. And I remember thinking, even at that time, being like, oh, I don't know, they just weren't on a bunch of steroids. And again, I don't care if people are on steroids. That's not being in shape in the same way. Like,
you should have entertainers. Like, who cares if entertainers are on steroids? Like,
I don't even give a shit if athletes are. I think maybe they should have. So here's my take.
Well, you want to know, Brian? Talk about fitness once again. In like weightlifting competitions, there are weightlifting competitions that allow steroids and ones that don't. So,
I think that's fine.
Yeah, I think that's fine too. I think that's great.
We can edit this out if you want, but since we've broached it, I want to get off my chest. My issue, and we obviously, I know you follow the Liver King bullshit, is that if you're doing them in public, you can still be into fitness and shit. I'm not, obviously it's not like you're lazy if you're ripped like that and you're doing steroids. You're still doing something. And I know you know what I'm saying. If you don't disclose that you're on steroids, then you're contributing to a lot of mental health problems for people, and it's particularly like young men.
Well,
so that's my issue.
Agree with that.
Is like the not disclosing of it. But anyways, my point was that Superman doesn't look all jacked out, which, so when you watch him, you're like, oh, it actually is pretty impressive that he's doing all this, because he's kind of a slight frame in these cartoons.
And also another comparison I have. So I would describe, and people have wanted to have this matchup, but we all know how it would go nowadays, but I would describe this Superman series as like Dragon Ball. And then as it goes on, Goku gets stronger and stronger and stronger.
I had the same thought. So like I am rewatching Dragon Ball.
He is Kid Goku in Dragon Ball.
Yeah.
Series. Like
so, okay, Kid Goku and Fleischer era Superman. Okay, we're gonna fudge our numbers here. Hey everyone, sound off in the comments with your Superman versus Goku comments.
Yeah.
I'm gonna troll us into getting a bunch of engagements.
Yeah.
Could Superman take Goku, or are they both P words?
Are they both massive wieners? No.
Yeah, I think Superman and Goku wouldn't fight each other. They'd just be gay together. And I think if you like either of them, you're also gay. Why did you sound off in the comments if you disagree, bitch?
Yes. And also to get more engagement, Goku is not Latino. I'm sorry, he is not. He is not Latino.
He's Asian. Like, what? Who is this the thing people are saying?
I'm just saying because it seems like Latin America loves Dragon Ball Z.
Well, sure, but black guys also love Goku. I mean,
that's true. Goku is
Goku's an honorary brother for sure.
Yeah, he's not. Oh shit! Oh man, we've gotten so off the rails. Speaking of,
I did have the same thought as you did about Dragon Ball, and Goku starts out being a mythic hero who's very strong, but still can be hurt and isn't impervious, and just gets so overpowered. And same with Superman. So that's a good observation.
And speaking of other Japanese media properties, let's get into episode 4, The Arctic Giant.
One of my favorites.
Brian, this is actually my favorite episode, so I'm glad that you agree that we both love it. And expedition unearths a frozen Tyrannosaurus in the Siberian tundra and brings it back to the USA. Naturally, it accidentally thaws and runs amok. Can Superman handle it? And you know what? Once again, I love seeing monsters just rampage through cities. It rocks.
Yeah, it's always cool. So, a little bit of personal history. I was waiting until we're here. I have a lot of opinions about superhero media. I think a lot of it that comes out over the last 10, 15 years is pretty boring. I was really into superhero comics, and especially older ones, as a kid. I became aware of this series when I was in 3rd or 4th grade because I was at a Dollar Tree and I saw, because these are in public domain, a tape with Superman on it and a giant monster. That was the monster from this. This is one of the 3 episodes of this series that were on this tape. It was the first one I saw. It's still one of my favorite ones. This is also the first creature episode of the series. There aren't very many.
There really isn't. Well, it's really weird, isn't it?
The reason for that, I think, is in the decades since, we think of the golden age of science fiction and then like the 50s kind of the atomic age, we kind of put them together. Giant monsters kind of weren't really that much of a thing until the 50s and the early 60s. So you'll see more of a focus mostly on like technology-driven criminals in the 1940s Superman. This stands out because it is just straight up a big monster dinosaur who also has, interesting to me, the way that the monster in this episode is designed has a lot of that Fleischer House style. Most of this Superman cartoon doesn't really have that style, that very cartoony, fluid, jokey style. It's very photorealistic and it's rotoscope. This is some of the first rotoscope animation.
Yeah,
but then you've got this dinosaur
views of the cityscape when he's like coming down from the sky. You see it, and it's like, oh my god, they did that in the 40s, like wild.
Yeah, it looks incredible. And then I think it gives a good variety. You have this dinosaur who kind of looks a little bit comic almost. He kind of moves around like a Disney villain. He's kind of frumpy and exaggerated, and he just adds a cool contrast to, you know, kind of the very realistic character designs of Superman and Lois, I think.
Absolutely. So yeah, this one's my favorite. Let's get into the next one here. The Bulleteers. Extortionists with a super powerful bullet-shaped flying rocket car threaten destruction to Metropolis. At first, they seem to defeat even Superman, but their capture of Lois Lane spurs him to new efforts. This one's fine. I didn't really have too many opinions on this one. It's just okay.
There's some cool animation. The Bulleteers, their car thing that transforms is cool. One of the things, because I had the exact same thought, it's not as good as the previous four, which I think are very exciting, but I want to say in defense of it, that might be because we did just watch, like I watched this whole series in 2 sittings, and the creators of these shows never in their life thought that anyone would be watching 2 of these cartoons in a row.
Yeah, that's actually a good point.
They were not intended to be watched one after the other like a film. And in fact, they probably thought that most people would see these once and never again. So, okay, if I'm a kid or, you know, an adult, presumably a lot of adults too going to this in 1940, and I'm going to see Superman, the new short, every week or every month or whatever, and I like them so far, and I came to see this one, I would probably think this was great. I'd be like, oh, cool, another Superman story. When you're watching them all in a row, you really become aware of which ones are really exciting and which ones kind of just feel like another Superman story. And this, to me, I'm kind of like, okay, it's another one. He's fighting a high-tech gang. It's pretty cool. It's cool animation. I mean, I love it. It looks great. There's no really thrilling animation. There's no really particularly thrilling set pieces or anything like there are in the best episodes to me in this.
All right, next episode, we're going to get to the magnetic telescope. An experimental magnetic telescope draws down a fireball from space. Despite warnings, the callous professor tries it again, this time on a full-fledged comet. Even Superman is unable to halt its mighty momentum. Is Metropolis doomed? Now, of course, Metropolis isn't doomed. It survives. But this is, I would say, better than episode 5, but still not
I like this one
of my favorites. It's a good one. It's not great, but it's a good one for me.
What I mostly like about this is you can tell that Fleischer are coming up with, how can we come up with variations on this technology run amok, you know, mad scientist kind of themes that we're doing that give them just enough variety. And I think the thing of, you know, the magnetic telescope pulling asteroids to Earth, and then because of the scientist's hubris, that's a mad scientist thing that I haven't seen anywhere else. It's pretty good.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that.
I like this one, or at least I remember it for that element. I find it more memorable than the previous episode. I think it's also, again, we're watching, you know, something like 7 of these, 10 of these in a row.
Yeah.
And they do tend to get repetitive because they have to tell this whole story and summarize Superman in 5-6 minutes.
All right, next episode.
I have a question for you about this next episode, though. So let's see if you have the same question I have.
So this one is Electric Earthquake. An American Indian fanatic tries to extort the return of Manhattan to his people with artificially induced earthquakes. Lois Lane's captive in his underwater hideout, and she must be rescued by Superman. Will Manhattan be destroyed? The answer is, of course, mostly, but not entirely. Now, this is the first episode I actively disliked. I did not like this one at all. I think it's fucking stupid. It's racist on top of it. Let's be real here.
Yeah. Well, it's also, I wanted to ask, because I wasn't clear on, do they explicitly say that the villain is a Native American, or is it like heavily implied? Because I was like, wait, are they actually saying this? I was kind of like, it was bugging me as I watched it.
I think it's heavily implied by the look that they give him.
And that he says, my people are the rightful owners of this island or whatever. But there is a thing that makes me laugh. This guy, you know, our quote unquote villain says, Manhattan belongs to my people. And Clark replies, possibly, in the smuggest voice possible.
Which he literally said, citation needed.
I mean, if you were making a commentary on how people talk to native people when they talk about being the rightful owners of this, possibly.
Yeah. You did a fucking Ben Shapiro voice to him? No. Like, well, actually, no.
It's also, the thing with this too is it's a variation on the same theme as episode 6, where what you're seeing too is it was really impressive, I think, for people at the time to show Superman going toe to toe with technology. There are a lot of big technologies coming out. Your average person doesn't know a lot about it and is excited by it, but maybe kind of scared. And really, to emphasize Superman's strength, we're going to show how he, as just a man, can go toe to toe or even do better than this force of technology. It's whatever, animation's nice. All of the animation in the Fleischer episodes is beautiful. So I'm never upset to be watching one. Oh yeah, I do have one other thought about this, and this comes up a few times. I do like that the city takes some actual damage.
Oh no, like, Manhattan when like probably like a million people die in this episode.
That's what I was saying. Like, so people died in this show pretty clearly. So that's pretty well demonstrated in this episode. And this is, for me, mostly another good example of the technology themes. A lot of it is like, how do we show that Superman is stronger than any other man? Well, we're going to have him be non-industrialized and just strong in a post-industrial era.
That's the thing, Brian, is that I think we all can agree that the one thing that Native American activists love doing is taking cutting edge technology and murdering millions of people with it. They're very good at that.
Why?
It's bizarre.
Why would this guy who wants this land, believes it belongs rightfully to his people, he also just wants to destroy it and fill it with probably all of these toxins from this machine?
Yeah, toxins and corpses. It's like, hey, Manhattan's actually, never mind. Manhattan's a wasteland. Very dumb. But yeah, yes. I will agree. The animation's still good. But yeah, the plot is offensively bad.
Yeah, this is the only Fleischer one I would say that is offensive, but it's also, you could maybe make the case that, well, I'm not going to get into that. I was going to say maybe it's more offensive because it's not reflective of like political trends at the time, but I'm not going to open that up. I mean, it's also just stupid. It just doesn't make sense.
It doesn't. Next episode here is Volcano is predicted on the inhabited island of Monacoa. Daily Planet reporters Clark and Lois accompany an expedition to study it, and of course Lois is quickly in danger from lava. Now, I like this one significantly more than the previous one.
I like this one quite a bit. Mostly what I like about it, too, is the idea that Superman is fighting a natural disaster. There isn't some elaborate thing to it. It's literally just like, what if there was a man that could combat an active volcano, which would not happen in a superhero story. Now, that would seem so pedestrian and so quaint, but like, that's, again, the idea of a man withstanding a volcano or like a hurricane or something would seem kind of crazy at the time. And I thought it was kind of cool. I also like the way the lava looks. I think there's some great animation on it. It looks hot. It looks bubbling and cauldrony with some beautiful Fleischer animation. It is pretty thrilling. You've got this scene where Lois is dangling from a wire as lava's flowing beneath her, and Superman is trying to maintain his composure as the heat's rising. Again, showing that he's not like infallible. He's not impervious to any pain. He's disoriented by this extreme heat, even if he can keep going. I like this one quite a bit.
Absolutely. All right, next episode here is Terror on the Midway, this is also the very last Fleischer episode. While Clark and Lois are reviewing a circus, Gigantic, the gorilla, escapes and endangers Lois in the resulting chaos after dangerous animals escape also. Is this a job for Superman? And of course it is. He saves the day as always. I also liked this one because he is also
one of my favorites.
Fighting against an animal. And also, we had Godzilla earlier, now we have King Kong.
Exactly. Yeah, no, this is one of my favorite ones. The animation is really great in it. I also do feel like, I don't have any way of knowing this, but it does feel like you're seeing Fleischer animation-wise firing on all cylinders. It's a little more ambitious. So this whole circus is in chaos. So it's not just that there's an ape, it's also that all these big cats have gotten loose and Superman's descending into this circus, obviously. There actually aren't very many, as we've said, full-on brawls in this, which can be a little disappointing. There is obviously a great slugfest between him and the robots in episode 2. And again here, you've got Superman basically boxing a giant ape while a circus tent catches fire around them. I think this is a real high point for the series. And if you wanted to see it as a finale of the Fleischer Studios run, I think it's a pretty decent one. It ends with Superman, again, boxing an ape while marauding elephants and big cats, rampage through a fire around them. It's pretty crazy. It's also, animation's a lot more cartoony. You've got a lot of action set pieces, but also snuck in there a lot of kind of rubber band Popeye, Betty Boop-esque kind of background characters in the first scene, which I thought was interesting. Really looks like the animators are kind of loosening up and kind of having fun with this one.
And then speaking of highs, let's get into some lows, because now we're getting into the famous Superman series. And I'm just going to say this out here. This episode title has a slur in it, but I'm just going to say it anyways. This episode title is Japo Tours.
Great. Cool.
American industry builds a gigantic new bomber, and Lois Lane stows away on the test flight. Little does she suspect, Japanese spies are aboard to hijack the giant. Is Superman to the rescue? And of course he does, and he slaps a Jap. No, he doesn't do that. But
did you see the 1941 Action Comics where it says that?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is the very first open propaganda episode. And to be fair to Famous Studios, because I'm sure they probably got some money from the U.S. government to do this, this was the very beginning of World War II. Anti-Japanese sentiment was at its very highest. Tensions were very high. I understand it's part of the war effort. But at the same time, guys, there's also some very minor, if you just blink and you miss it, some bucktooth, racial stereotypes going on. This is not the very worst episode of the series.
No, there's some worse ones.
It's the second or third worst. This is not good. I don't like this.
No, the thing too is, like, again, there's the bucktooth slanty-eyed animation. If you see really quickly, this series is not as bad about that as some of its contemporaries, especially in comic books, were about that.
It's war effort.
No, it's boring, and it was made to do a war effort story. Like, I've absolutely got money to make this. Also, right off the bat, and this continues for almost this whole run. Now it's Famous Studios instead of Fleischer. These don't feel as fun. I mean, they feel a little bit more grounded. They're a little bit less fantastical. I feel like a lot of the Fleischer stories are kind of tied to this thing of, like, Superman is the man of tomorrow, and he's living in this age of technology. And here it's kind of, the whole world feels a little bit more dour and Famous, even in the non-racist episodes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we really see that right off the bat here.
Yeah, it's... All right, well, speaking of better episodes here, let's get into episode 11, Showdown. This one has a jewel thief going around dressed as Superman, and we first see Superman stealing jewels, and it's like, oh, that can't be Superman. Well, it turns out it is a jewel thief, once again, pretending to be Superman. Clark Kent meets the imposter at the opera, and that's where the imposter meets the real Superman. Catching the low-class crook is easy, but behind the cheap gangster is a powerful crime boss. He proves more resourceful than his stooge. Now, I actually liked this one quite a bit. I thought this was a fun episode.
Actually, one of my favorite episodes of the series, to be honest.
Agreed.
There is no other episode in the series like this. It's pretty funny. You've got this bumbling Superman imposter and then his sinister boss over him, who's pretty threatening. It's also just, there aren't any other gangland kind of villains for Superman, which is a good thing because they aren't really much of a match for him. So doing it more than once would be kind of lame. No, I like this episode a lot. It's pretty different from the series in general, but pretty different, especially from the other Famous Studios episodes, in that it's pretty funny. To me, it does kind of harken back to the tone of the Fleischer ones more than some of the other ones in this run, in that it's a little bit cartoony. You know, the character designs and the animation on the lackey who's impersonating Superman are very cartoony and kind of caricaturesque. This is probably my favorite Famous Studios episode.
It is mine too, and it's the only one in my top 5. It's the only Famous one in my top 5, so that should say something.
I think it is for me as well.
All right, well, speaking of highs, once again, let's get into some lows. We're in episode 12, the 11th hour. Somehow, reporters Clark and Lois manage to visit wartime Japan. While there, Superman commits a little sabotage at 11 each night. Of course, this endangers Lois, to the point where they're literally about to execute Lois because Superman keeps sabotaging Japanese war efforts.
Yeah, dear God.
This one is awful. This is easily the worst episode of the entire series. I hated this.
I do not think this is the worst one of the series, but we will get to why. I will say,
I would argue there's maybe one worse, but this is at least my bottom 2.
Yeah. So this episode more offensive than Japatours. If that should tell you something. Most definitely, yeah. But it does have more going on. It's less boring to watch. There's some what would be cool wartime animation. There's a cool change of setting. There's this kind of blood red sky over. It would be a cool setting for a Superman story. But again, Superman is now just engaging in war crimes in this.
Yeah. No, you're literally correct. Like, Superman goes from saving the day and, like, beating up actual bad guys to just committing war crimes in, like, 3 episodes. Yeah, I gotta remember 3 episodes before this. I'm sorry, 2 episodes before this. He was fighting a giant gorilla.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, he was fighting technology run amok and bank robbers and things. And yeah, I mean, this kind of is reflective of the whole Famous Studios era. Kind of unpleasant. Again, even a lot of the episodes without the pro-war, the anti-Japanese sentiment, kind of feels like a more unpleasant world than it is in the first run.
Yeah. And, speaking of unpleasant, episode 13, Destruction Inc. A murder at the Metropolis Munitions plant draws Lois Lane into the thick of a sabotage plot. She ends up inside a torpedo about to be tested. Meanwhile, where is Superman? Now, once again, we're talking about how bleak a lot of these include actual people being murdered.
Yeah, which it is fine, I guess, but it's a little coming right after the Fleischer episodes, which I guess implicitly have people dying in catastrophes. But, this, people, a guy, yeah, I have that in my notes too. Someone gets fucking shot. Like, it gets a gut shot with a gun in this episode.
Is this the first animated series that explicitly mentioned murder?
Maybe it could be.
Because this is pretty fucking early in, especially color animation. This is pretty
well,
fucking
and it's
early.
Definitely early in action adventure animation. So that's very possible that this is one of the first mentions of murder in a Looney Tunes context or something.
Yeah, like an actual, this person was actually fucking murdered. Not hey, dynamite blew up and their, fucking beak got put on the other side of their head or whatever. Goofy ass shit like that, yeah. I actually remember very little about this episode, to be honest.
There's a horrible comic relief character named Lewis who just feels very out of place. He's like, my name is Lewis, not Lois. And he looks like Alfred E. Newman.
Yep, I remember this episode then.
The one good thing I will say about this, in a mixed way, Lois, she's pretty proactive and takes a lot of the action here. In fact, I would say Lois has more to do in this episode than Superman, which could be good or bad. But I have in my notes here, in general, the famous films shy away from science fiction in favor of organized crime, if not war propaganda. It's a kind of a dingier world. I have to believe that probably wasn't a conscious thing, but it must have reflected some changes going on in the studio that the series, when it goes from Fleischer to Famous, again, become less fun, I think kind of less creative, and more to these kind of gritty urban landscapes, which to me don't really suit Superman the way that they would suit someone like Batman.
I will agree with that 100%. All right. Next episode here is episode 14, The Mummy Strikes. After famed Egyptologist Dr. Jordan is found dead at the foot of King Tut's sarcophagus with a syringe by his side, his assistant Jane Hogan is charged with poisoning him and eventually convicted of murder. Now, once again, this is a Superman plot. At the Daily Planet, Kent receives a call from Dr. Wilson of the Egyptian Museum, who tells him of the mummy's curse. An examination of the sarcophagus quickly reveals how Dr. Jordan was killed, but when King Tut reanimates his personal guards, it will take all of Superman's strength to save the day. Now, once again, I actually, even though this is a Superman plot, a little out there for a Superman plot, I actually did like this episode.
I like it in theory, because it's a mummy, and that's a different thing for Superman. I like that. Did you feel like there was a lot of dialogue in this episode?
This was definitely the most dialogue heavy, because something we didn't mention earlier is that most of the episodes feature very little dialogue. Especially the early episodes have very little spoken dialogue.
Yeah, and it's why is there so much exposition in this? I don't need to know the history of the mummy. I just want to see Superman fight a mummy. Goddamn.
Yeah.
Also, this is, I think, one of the shortest episodes in the series, so a bad choice to make very dialogue heavy.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I like that this is a change for the series. On paper, it's very exciting. We're going to see this classic incarnation of Superman go against a supernatural creature. This is the only supernatural villain of the whole series. But again, this is one of the shortest episodes, or at least it feels like it in the series. And it's so dialogue heavy. We're given basically the history of this mummy king. And I don't need that. I just need to know that there's a mummy, he's back to life, and Superman's going to fight him. So kind of disappointing for me on this one. This was actually one that it should be a bright point in the Famous Studios era, because it's more fantastical and it's more fun, but I just want to see Superman boxing a mummy.
Yeah, I will agree with most of that. I think why I like it better than some of the other famous ones is what you said earlier. It is definitely a change of pace from just outright war propaganda, so it was kind of a nice change of pace. So I like that it tried something different, and I will agree, I don't think it hit all of it, but it was interesting to see them try it at the very bare minimum.
Yeah.
So I give them props for that, because especially in this time frame, I think a lot of people were probably just like, hey, let's see this next anti-Japanese propaganda. Like, wait, mummies, what is this?
Yeah, exactly. This actually kind of feels, this plot, the whole thing with finding the hypodermic needle and the wrongly charged assistant, almost feels more like a Batman story of the era than a Superman.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like a Superman story, which is why I'm like, oh yeah, this is a Superman story, because it just makes it doesn't fit with any of the other episodes.
Yeah. And coming up next, so this is my worst episode.
I will agree. I think this and the 11th Hour are tied. Although I think 11th Hour, at least the animation's a little bit better, so I might give it a little bit more props. But yeah, this is episode 15, Jungle Drum. A jungle temple with a hooded priest is really a Nazi military base, which downs a plane bearing Lois Lane and some secret plans. Can Superman save her from human sacrifice? Yeah, I would say this is in my bottom 2. Depending on the day, it might be my very worst. But yeah, this is awful.
For me, this is the worst episode. It's very distasteful. I mean, one of the things that I really want to drive home is the villain of this episode is a Nazi. There is no reason, even in the context of the time, to make African natives villainous in this.
Yeah, the whole idea the fuck was that?
The villain is a white supremacist. Do you know what I mean? So, this episode almost is sort of tacitly endorsing, obviously, systemically or whatever, white supremacy. Yeah, I don't want to get into this whole thing. It's just very what the fuck is this? Why can't you just make an episode where he fights a Nazi? Why when you have Superman fight a racist white guy, do you immediately have to go oh, but it's actually he's manipulating these monstrous cannibal savages who want to eat Lois Lane and play on the bongo drums or whatever. It's fucking gross. Look, there's some okay animation in this. There was some very nice animation that is almost on par with the Fleischer era. Again, it's a change of scenery. There's a lot of cool looking stuff with again, kind of ominous, foreboding fire in the distance and red skies and things. It's just deeply unfortunate that it serves this bullshit. And again, I just can't drive home how weird it is to me that when they finally make the villain of an episode a Nazi, they have to also make black people villains of the episode. It just leaves a really bad fucking taste in my mouth.
Yeah, because Nazis did take a lot of, they appropriated a lot of inspiration from other non-European cultures, sure.
Of course, sure.
They didn't fucking go to Africa and be like, oh yeah, simple African, tell me the ways of your culture. They didn't do anything like that.
Yeah, no.
They went to fucking Tibet or something.
I can't shake this weird feeling, and I feel like maybe I'm overthinking it, and I'm trying not to do that. I get this weird feeling that it's oh, did someone famous not want to just do an episode where the villain was a racist? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's bizarre. Speaking of Tibet, Brian, you know about the Nazi expedition to Tibet to find ancient Aryans, right? Hilarious stuff. So funny.
Yeah.
And he is an awful, awful person, but Alfred Rosenberg was easily one of the fucking most bizarre, hilarious Nazis.
Nazi esotericism is fucking hilarious and how stupid it is.
100%, yeah.
No, this is my least favorite episode because, okay, I don't want to get too into this can of worms. We're both white guys. This isn't on us to speak in. At least with 11th Hour and Chapters, you can argue these are wartime things and it's targeted at an enemy of the U.S. during war. I'm not saying that's good or that that's okay or that it was okay then, but it makes sense. There is no reason to have these awful depictions of African people in this episode. It's not necessary to the story. Definitely not necessary to having a story where a Nazi is the villain. It's almost the opposite. It's almost I'm kind of dancing around saying it. It's you don't really want to make the villain a white supremacist. So you have to be oh, if Nazis have their way, then black people will be out of control. That's how I read this. And maybe I'm overthinking it. This episode makes me feel pretty gross, and it's very disappointing in this series in a way even beyond the way that the other wartime propaganda episodes are for me.
I think your reading of it is accurate because, even though obviously the Nazis and, at this point, the Japanese, I would say, were our primary enemies in World War II. I mean, they were the people we declared war on fucking first. And then the Germans, a couple days later, were fuck it, we're going to war with you too. So it's one of those things where it is, and especially, of course, the Nazis took a lot of ideological inspiration, especially on their, Nuremberg laws from American Jim Crow laws. Yeah. So they had a lot in common ideologically, especially from, a base perspective. So I think the idea of like, hey, if the Nazis take control, maybe they'll use our like internal minorities against us. Like that's probably not like an insane thought for like some weird random like white supremacist back in the day.
And that is how I read this episode. I'm not saying necessarily that anyone in Famous Studios or Paramount was thinking that explicitly in those terms about it, but that is like the message that comes across this, and I find it more distasteful than the other propaganda episodes.
Yeah, because even though the Japanese ones are bigoted and racist, they're at least a little bit more realistic.
Well, they at least follow a logic, which
they
is
do follow, a logic. That's the word I would use. They're definitely more they follow a certain logic that in some world could make sense. Could make sense.
Yes,
theoretically.
Yeah.
But speaking of logic, things that don't make any logical sense, let's get into episode 16, The Underground World. The original Discoverer's son takes Clark Kent and Lois exploring in unknown regions of Henderson Caves. Henderson and Lois enter an underground world of hawkmen who have deadly plans for them. Now, I like this one significantly more than the last one, but this one's good to okay. I
think this one's pretty good for a Famous Studios one. So I will agree with that, yes. The final of the 3 that were on the initial tape I had as a kid. The one thing I want to say for this, again, beautiful animation. Oh, actually, before that, there is foreshadowing at the beginning of this episode where they say, like, oh, be careful of those explosives in the very beginning. And I'm just like, oh, there's foreshadowing in this one. They're writing.
Yeah.
Nice animation. There's a lot of shadows and there's them venturing into this mysterious cavern. I will say for Famous Studios, they certainly tried to change the settings that they put Superman and Lois in. And I can appreciate that, even though I think that the Metropolis sort of technology-heavy setting of the Fleischer run works better. Superman and Lois journeying to a mass subterranean cavern and not knowing how deep it goes and just going in is a cool premise. The creatures that they encounter are, human bird people. They're fine. They're a little underwhelming. I'm not really super clear on why they have to be bird people because they barely even fly. But we at least get to see this version of Superman kind of get into a brawl with a gang of monster people. I kind of think this episode might have been cooler if it didn't lead to them fighting these bird people, and it was just Superman and Lois exploring these cavernous, like, underground dwelling and the mysteries of it. But, and that maybe would be a longer episode that we didn't have time for. For me, one of the better Famous Studios ones. I do like this episode. I'm going to say, even though I love the Fleischer era and the episodes of the Famous Studios era that aren't racist, I do still like I still enjoy watching them.
Me too. I agree with that.
But, if I'm just showing some of these, I'm going to show them the Fleischer ones. I'm going to show them the first 4 episodes of the Fleischer run and probably not the Famous ones for the most part, except for maybe Showdown.
I will definitely.
No, this one's fine. It's also fair to say that because, again, I think this is a pretty good Superman story, and it's a bit closer again to the Fleischer run than other ones in this kind of run of episodes. It's also possible that I'm on episode 16 of 17 and I'd watched about 2 hours of these pretty repetitive shorts in a day. So maybe I was a little burnt out on this one. And maybe if this one had been at the beginning, I would have been more into it. That's fair.
No, I agree with that. And speaking of, let's get into our final one here. Episode 17, Secret Agents. Clark Kent helps a pretty blonde federal agent escape a gang of Nazi saboteurs and lets himself be captured to learn their plans. The blonde, pursued again, falls into the gears of a drawbridge. Can Superman save her? The answer is yes, of course he saves her. And this was, I would say, easily the least bad of the propaganda ones.
Yeah, it's fine.
It's fine. It's actually a really funny one to end on because it ends with an American flag waving in the background.
Yeah, and I wonder, I thought that too, and I was like, that's fine. One of the things while we're coming past it is you'll notice that at this point, Superman does not fight for truth, justice, and the American way. Siegel and Schuster initially did not want the American way in there. They felt like it was too specific and too politicized. They just wanted him to fight for... He actually originally fought for truth, justice, and the oppressed people of the world, is what it says in his first appearance.
Oh, of course they took that one off. Of course they took that one off. Of course,
yes. But maybe even not soon, but now that we've done this, maybe we'll do a bonus episode where we'll do a walkthrough of the first Superman story just to highlight some of those differences, because I'd be pretty interested in where maybe I'll just, I'll go through it and I'll read it out or something, or some of the set pieces, because it's pretty interesting how different it is in 1938 already from what you see here. This is fine. My one big note on this is that there are cool shootouts in this. I like the shootouts in this animation style. I also just I'm like, oh yeah, you're seeing a lot of bullets flying. Doesn't really have much to do with Superman for me. In fact, Superman doesn't have a whole lot to do in this episode.
And once again, as we mentioned earlier, this is the only one without Lois Lane. Why isn't Lois Lane here?
Because they only have one model for a female character, and
it's Lois's. That's true.
So they just changed Lois's hair blonde.
Oh man, they did palette swap. They did the 1940s version of palette swapping.
They absolutely did.
All right, so before we get into our final thoughts here, let's get into some Amazon thoughts. Now, Brian, I was not able to find a comprehensive collection of all the Amazon reviews for the series, but I did find one Blu-ray release that had a certain amount of reviews, so I used that as the well for these Amazon reviews. Now, a lot of these reviews are long as shit, so I only included 3. So we're not going to spend all day going over Amazon reviews, so... Good. And I found some positive and some negative ones, so that's good. First review I have here is from Michael A. Byer, who gives this movie gives the series 5 stars. And the header of the review says, wonderful. And the body of the review says, if you're a fan of Superman or comic books in general, get this DVD. The shorts in this DVD are good old-fashioned serial movies, animated brilliantly by the Fleischer brothers. Yes, the material is dated, and sometimes unintentionally hilarious. In one episode, Clark Kent ducks into the broom closet of the Daily Planet, turns on the light so everyone can see him, and changes into Superman. Awesome. We see him taking off his pants. Then he apparently walks out of the broom closet, presumably leaving his clothes behind, gets in the elevator in his Superman costume, and takes it down to the lobby, where he then flies out the front door on his way to fight crime.
That's one of my favorite parts of this series.
But it's interesting to see the movie studio's first treatment of Superman. He is more of a man, or in other words, more mortal. His superpowers are flying, being bulletproof, or super strength. That's it. He uses X-ray vision in exactly one of the episodes. He is more easily knocked unconscious or magically loses his power to fly after being knocked from a perch. Lifting a plane or dragging a giant train is a real chore for him, but nonetheless a truly superhuman accomplishment. Also in these cartoons, there is no heat vision, no Fortress of Solitude, no Kryptonite, no Lex Luthor, no Bizarro either. The villains here are nameless mad scientists who have constructed wires that cause earthquakes in Manhattan, or mechanical monsters who are bank robbers, or evil men who wear hoods, well, we talked about that one earlier, and drive around in a bullet car that destroys civic buildings. And finally, Lois Lane. She is a piece of work. She works to sabotage Clark Kent's journalism.
Look at the gams on that broad.
Yeah. At every turn while hogging all of the scoops and glory for herself. Not only that, she is shooting machine guns while driving an out-of-control train, tailing bad guys by jumping into their motorboat or evil mechanical monster in order to gain access to their secret lairs. It's terrific. Finally, the colors and shadow work in these movies is nothing short of masterful. This is a must for any fan of Superman and particularly of animation. And I agree with almost all of that.
This is a good review. One thing, it's interesting, and I kind of alluded to it before. I had a feeling most of the reviews you would find would be more focused on Blu-ray collections than specific episodes, because, and I've been a fan of this series for a long time, it's public domain, so it's been on a lot of formats, and I've had a lot of VHSs and DVDs of it, and the quality is so all over. I mean, I'm pretty sure I know the Blu-ray edition that this is a review of. There has never been a very across-the-board satisfactory edition of these collected. But no, this is a good review. I think that this guy has a good grasp of what makes this series work. And I do think it would be important if you were showing this to someone who didn't know, hey, this is old Superman. There's like a mention of Krypton. There's no Fortress of Solitude. There's no Lex Luthor. There's barely any shit that you would recognize as Superman besides Superman himself.
Yeah. And also, we were talking about satisfactory releases. As of recording this, about 2 weeks ago, there was a new release of this series on Blu-ray from DC themselves.
Which I'm probably going to get.
I will say DC and Warner Brothers Blu-ray releases are pretty hit and miss. I am not going to say that it's the definitive release, but if it is, they finally fucking did it. So we'll see.
Well, I'm probably going to get this because I've had a few different editions on. There was a DVD one that came out, I think, when I was in maybe early high school that I got. That was the best one for a long time. That was an official Paramount one. So, man, it was kind of cute. It had Clark winking on the cover to indicate that it was official. One of the issues that comes with a lot of the digital restorations of this, and I have read in some of the reviews of the recently released the DC collection, is that they clean it up a little too much. And this is going to sound stupid. They clean up too much of the grain from the cells, and it kind of makes it look weird because it wasn't meant to be seen in that high definition.
It's kind of like when a lot of classic video games get played on TVs. It just doesn't look right.
Exactly. That's why even in this, we watched this YouTube collection, which was, I believe, a fan restoration, and they did a pretty great job. Sometimes the faces look a little weird because when you see like Lois and Clark's faces without the grain, something about it, just the lines and the colors blend together differently, and it's a little strange. But having said that, I don't think that they're ever going to intentionally release it with that grain because they're afraid that people won't like it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll probably get this Blu-ray edition. I'm waiting on it. I have all of these on VHS. I have a VHS box set with all of them. That is still, if I can watch it that way, it's my preferred. I don't have a VHS player right now. So I collect weird VHS tapes, and I've had this set for years. These are my favorite ways to watch this because you still get the grain. It looks like it's directly on film. It's probably as close as you'll get to the way that it looked on film stock, which is to say not very much, in terms of quality. But I will probably get this Blu-ray edition. But everything I'm seeing is that it has the same problem that previous digital restorations have, where it cleans up too much of the grain. I guess the audio is fantastic in it, is what people are saying.
That actually might make it worth it for me, because the audio in the YouTube releases is definitely very compressed.
Yeah, it is.
But you know what, Brian, speaking of inadequate releases, this next review I have is about a very specific inadequate release, apparently. It was also the highest rated review for this entry on Amazon, so a lot of people agreed with this one. I think this is the very first time I've ever seen the most highly rated review be an overwhelmingly negative review for this show, so that's kind of interesting to see. And this is, once again, this is only about this specific release. This is not about the TV show in itself. Richard Weddle gives this 1 star, and the header of the review says, "Not recommended. Gaiam Blu-ray is poor quality and watermarked." The body of the review says, "This review refers to the Gaiam Blu-ray edition and only to the Gaiam Blu-ray edition. Avoid this Blu-ray. It is poorly upscaled from standard DVD, waxy looking and pixelated because of too much digital cleanup. It's also too bright, eliminating the film noirish nighttime atmosphere of the cartoons. Worse, the Gaiam logo is permanently burned in the lower right corner of the image. The logo is big and noticeable and can't be removed, so you have to look at Gaiam throughout each cartoon.
What a shitty thing to do on a public domain.
I know, fucking awful, right? And there are many cheap public domain editions of Fleischer's Superman cartoons. It's easy to buy the wrong one. This is the worst. Don't buy this edition. Instead, buy the latest high-def restorations authorized by DC Comics and released by Warner Brothers Video on DVD." Now, this was before, of course, the most recent release, so I guess at the time, this was apparently the best one. It states,
yeah, and I had that one at the time.
It states DC Comics and authorized edition from original masters on the cover. Alternately, there is also the first digital restoration released by Image/Bosco in 2000, but DC/Warner DVD is the sharpest with the best color. Both editions are sold by Amazon. So that is their review here. And Gaiam, shame on you.
Yeah, that sucks. And that is a thing for a long time. Because as a kid, 9-10 years old, when I got that VHS tape, and I was like fascinated by it. I was fascinated by how succinct all these stories were. I was fascinated by how it captured like this very specific time for Superman. I was this weird kid who was really into like just the history of pop culture. So I love this. And I would actually see 20 VHS tapes of this series all over. And I'd always buy them because I didn't know at the time how many episodes there were in the series. And sometimes you'd see a tape that had 2 that I'd already seen, and then one you hadn't, and I would just try to get them all. Finally, yeah, that DC authorized edition came out when I was in high school, and I did buy that. But at the time, that was great. I'm now pretty aware of the digital cleanup stuff that bugs me, but I think that's just a thing we're probably going to have to deal with going forward in releases of this.
Absolutely. All right, and the very last review I have here is a pretty short one. This is from Amazon customer, probably the most prolific Amazon reviewer, who gives us 5 stars. And the header of the review says, "Fleischer's Superman cartoons." And the body of the review says, "Even in the light of today's animation and Disney, these were unique and very entertaining. Max and Dave were underrated. You will find them very enjoyable, and it is great to have them all together. Many effects were done here that were not done elsewhere. And as well, I remember when the very first one came out, it was well received." So this person's like 100 years old.
Really? Is this legit? This guy, like, he called them Max and Dave, so like, fuck, maybe.
Yeah, he personally knew them. Like,
yeah, they really did good job. The big thing I want to point out, we didn't really, we kind of talked a little bit about it. The big reason to watch these overall is because the animation is so stellar, especially for the time. It's so influential. I still think that in animation, there is almost nothing else like this. It's very influential to early anime, And later,
Yes.
Hayao Miyazaki is a huge fan of this series, and you can see in a lot of his films visual homages to it. Of course, the Batman animated series of the 1990s, this is the direct model for that animation style.
Yeah, and we were talking about earlier with, of course, you said Miyazaki, and as well Tezuka animation, very much so, with like Astro Boy and Kimba, the White Lion, and shit like that. Like, definitely some very strong inspiration from those, especially if you watch Astro Boy. Like, the faces on Astro Boy are definitely inspired, I'll just say.
Yeah, very much. Also some American like alternative animation. If you are familiar with Heavy Metal, the 1980s fantasy, adult fantasy, heavily inspired animation style from this. Really, if you have an interest in comic book, even like just an interest, I guess, in pop art, this is almost to me like kind of required, because it is still 80 years later, I would say almost unparalleled in animation.
Yeah,
maybe the classic era Disney stuff.
Yeah, I was gonna say maybe classic like early Disney stuff is maybe a little bit more, but this and early Disney are pretty much like the pioneers of animation, like straight up.
And I don't think Disney were doing much rotoscope. Snow White was rotoscope, but I don't think at this time they were doing much else beyond that.
I don't think so, no.
This is all rotoscope, except for some of the creatures.
Yeah, and it once again, as we mentioned many times, as many people in our reviews mentioned, the animation in this is pretty fucking good, especially for the time. It's very fucking good.
Especially in the Fleischer run. I'm going to be honest, if you aren't like I'm a huge fan of the series. So I will watch all of these again at some point in my life. Probably like within a year, I will watch the Fleischer ones again. That first year of shorts, the first 9?
Yeah, the first 9 episodes.
Yeah. That's tops. That's some of the greatest animation I've ever seen. That's some of my favorite cartooning ever.
Yeah, except for episode 7, which is if you can just look past that one pretty major glaring flaw.
Yeah.
Otherwise than that, it's no skips for those first 9 episodes.
Well, the one thing I would say is if you just wanted to watch these, not to review them, I would suggest people not watch them the way we did. In fact, Taylor, when I was brainstorming this episode, you'll remember I was kind of on the fence about if I wanted you to watch all of them. Part of me was like, that might be an unfair way to judge the series, because they weren't written to be consumed that way.
Yeah.
And I was originally going to have you watch. I was going to pick 4 and then pick 4 to have you watch. And then I was thinking, but we should both see a good amount of both the famous and Fleischer Studios ones to kind of see how they are alike and different. And then I was like, well, we'll just review them all. We'll get it out of the way. But if you just are interested in this series, you should check them out. Check out these first 9 episodes by Fleischer. Maybe not the one with the American Indian. It's not great, but one of the other ones, especially one of the first 4 or so, but maybe don't binge them. Maybe watch one after work and maybe watch one while you're having your coffee. They're 10 minutes long or so.
Yeah, and I actually found a YouTube compilation that somebody made of all the episodes separated instead of just the whole block of them. So yeah, I would definitely recommend watching this 1 or 2 episodes at a time.
Yeah.
I would definitely not recommend watching this all in one sitting, because especially once it gets to the famous episodes, it is just a blur.
To be honest, so I watched this the other day, divided into 2 sittings. I watched all the Fleischer ones, and then I went out and did some stuff, and then that night before bed, I watched all the famous ones. The Fleischer ones watching in a sitting, for me, who is pretty easy for me to watch all the Fleischer ones in a row. But yeah, once you get to those famous ones, you're kind of like, okay, this is kind of all running together. Okay, here's something's happening, and now something racist is happening, and now something else is happening.
I will say I'm glad you recommended this, though, because I would have never watched this whole series otherwise. And it was cool to see something so influential that I had, frankly, very little knowledge of beforehand. Like, I knew a little bit about it, but I don't think I saw a single full episode of this series until we reviewed this.
One of the things, too, for me is if you look at how... I think it's starting to wane now, but for so long in the 2000s and 2010s, everything was superheroes. But for me, it was all so convoluted.
Yeah.
And then you look at this, and this is for me kind of like one of the pinnacles of superhero adaptations, precisely because it's so, and of course it's a different time. I'm not saying that they should make them just like this now or that would even be possible, but like this works because you just take the fundamentals of the character of Superman, and you just have him do cool shit. And you don't have to have, first of all, you don't have to have all these relatable character moments. You don't have to have Superman overcoming his trauma or whatever the fuck about being an orphan.
You don't see him have a realistic panic attack.
Yeah, like with the...
Shit. Yeah, I would much rather watch this than pretty much any modern superhero IP. I'm just going to be real here.
Well, even like, I mean, I even think if you're just, maybe this is dated for people who are superhero fans, which is totally understandable, totally fair, is over 80 years old. But like, maybe you like that Bruce Tim Paul Dini Batman DC animated universe, which is fantastic. Yeah, that is all directly descended from this. Like it is. Just visually, it's so indebted to this series.
100%. Yeah, definitely a great series. I really enjoyed it. So speaking of we're millennials are old, I'm getting old as shit. It's time for me to go to bed pretty soon. Brian, do you have any last parting thoughts before we end here?
Well, I was going to go to bed. It sounds like there's some ruckus downtown. I live in Portland. There's always something going on. I'm hearing explosions in the distance, screaming, and I'm looking around for a phone booth. But I gotta go.
Ooh, shit. All right. And yeah, this is going to be me. Thankfully, the streets of Milwaukee are very well known for being quiet. So I'm going to tucker in for the night. But
sorry, Taylor, I'm changing in this phone booth right now. I can't quite hear you.
Oh, shit.
So
okay.
Totally...
So follow me at carloschantor.twitter.com. Brian,
follow me at John Stab. I gotta go.
All right. Have a good night, everybody.